Okay, we are doing great, and we have our outwale mahogany trim sanded down beautifully, down to starting with 120, and then sanded it down to with 220. Actually, I went 120, 180, 220. It just saves a little work rather than jumping straight to 220 from the 120. And it turned out beautifully. We rounded it and made sure we sanded along the bottom edge to get any epoxy off in that in the corner, and that's just going to be gorgeous when we varnish it. At the stern, I'm real pleased with the way the curved outwale came around the drake tail, and that was a fun detail. It's a little bit more challenging, and you do have the option of doing it the simpler way if you think this might be a little bit difficult for you. And either way looks very similar. And I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see. I am going to touch this up a little bit, and I'm going to use an interesting technique on it. There. See, there are it's not very much of a gap, but just little gap right at the top edge. It's very tight at the bottom edge. It's stuck on there solidly. But there's just a little bit of a gap, shallow gap right along here that you can see. So what we're going to do for that is, well, we could just ignore it, and I don't think it'd be very noticeable after the boat's finished and varnished. But what we're going to do for that is we're going to mix some of the sanding dust from sanding the outwale, the mahogany trim piece. We're going to mix some of the sanding dust into clear epoxy resin and fill those gaps with that material. We could use the phenolic powder, and that color blends quite nicely, but not absolutely perfectly. Whereas if we use the sanding dust from the outwale, that'll blend almost perfectly with the color of the mahogany, because it is the mahogany dust that we're using. So you could save a little pile of that to mix in. You just need a few drops of resin to fill those cracks in, and that'll be a fun technique to experiment with. And we're just starting to punch out some more of the parts. I think we can get a little bit ahead now with punching out the parts, and you're not going to get confused at this point what is what, because there are not all that many parts left. We are making such good progress. So let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got going. And let's see. We have this is the front seat here, and that came out of sheet number 6, and we've got that sanded down. And here's the back seat in 2 pieces. That's going to go together like that. And that's again, each piece came out of sheet number 6. And we started to work on the rudders. These are the inner parts of the rudder, the ones with the slot cut in them. We haven't taken the pieces out of the cockpit yet. We'll leave those in as long as possible, but now we've got our outwales on, the mahogany strips on the outside edge of the boat. I think you really could take out the pieces inside the cockpit cutout any time at this point, but no point in rushing it. But that hull shape now is pretty well locked in by laminating those 2 mahogany pieces on each side. So not to worry too much there. Some of these other pieces you might leave in for a little bit longer. These long pieces, they're pretty obvious. These are the pieces that run along the inside edge of the cockpit cutout to the transom, towards the stern, and they're going to be joined by these other 2 pieces out of the long pieces are out of sheet 6, same as the seats for the front and back seats. These 2 pieces are coming out of sheet 5, and they're the same width but different lengths. We can take those both out, and those 2 pieces are going to wrap around the front of the cockpit. Now you have to be careful with these, because if you just bend them, they're going to break. They have to be very kind of massaged gently into shape. If you do break one of these, you have plenty of room around the sides of some of your sheets to make new pieces, and then try to be more careful next time. fitting them in. You can just cut this with a your mat knife, but you want to sort of massage it into shape to get it to take that bend. It's not going to just bend and take that shape without any coaxing. You have to coax it into shape a little bit. And these two pieces are different lengths, so you won't have a butt joint where both pieces end at the same point. You'll have an overlap joint. And so the long skinny pieces run to the back and overlap at the back onto the deck at the back. You can see that overlap there. I haven't cleaned up this piece yet. And then these front pieces wrap around the front, and these long pieces are over length, so one will be cut shorter to meet the shorter front wrap around piece at the front, and the other will be cut longer. And these pieces, there are 4 of them, so they get laminated in place as well. Okay, so I guess that gives you a bit of a preview about where some of these pieces are going. And so I'm going to break out these pieces and sand the edges, sand the tabs off, and clean up the fuzz. And I think the other pieces I'll leave in the sheets for now. Again, because I don't want to lose them underneath the clutter. And also it's a little bit easier if you know, I can tell you what part, what sheet number that the part will come out of. Well, these pieces we can clean up too. You're not going to get confused about these. This is the rudder, the keel, outside lamination. The keel is built like a sandwich, and this is like the bread of the sandwich lays on the outside of the inner pieces, which are like the cheese of the sandwich, the inside surface. So these can be cleaned up as well. Be very careful though, it's easy to break these because you can see what a fine point that comes to at the tip. So and then I can set aside the empty. That last piece came out of sheet number. I think it was out of this sheet. What sheet was it? Oh no, it came out of this sheet. That last piece came out of sheet number 2. And there's one more of those keel faces to find as well. And that's in, where is it? I might have that piece out already, since I'm not seeing it. Well, you'll find it. It's not in these. Don't be careful. Don't throw away a sheet that still has a piece in it. That would be. Don't throw any of your sheets away until you've totally completed the project, because you may find some of these. Like if you break one of the front surrounds, you'll want to be able to cut it out of one of your sheets. So that other piece came out of. Oh. Here we are. No, I haven't taken it out yet. The other keel face piece comes out of sheet number 1, right there at the end of sheet number 1. And so sheet number 6 I'm going to keep here on the table, but I think that's the only sheet now that has parts in it. And 7E if you're doing the electric version, or 7S if you're doing the steam version. Okay, so don't break this all up yet, in case you need a piece of extra wood. But you can set these things aside, and we'll get this number 1 out of our way. And this might be a good time to do a general kind of cleaning up, putting away the tools that you've used and may not need anymore, and just get yourself organized. I tend to get excited about working on the project and always want to progress. And so it gets a little cluttered because I don't stop to put things away. That every now and then you're going to be defeating yourself if you don't get your work surface more organized. So I'll be back when I've got all these parts that we punched out together sanded. I've also taken, we've worked with the floorboards already. They're sanded. So I'll put those aside. And when we get all these sanded and our workspace cleaned up a little bit, we'll be back and move on to the next step. Little preview. We will be, these are the center part of the keel, and they will be glued together. These two narrower pieces, they'll be glued together. And the two other top parts which I've got here. I'll find them when I clean up. The little triangular pieces sit up here and complete the missing part of the inner cheese part of the keel. This part right here. Okay, so that'll give you a little preview of where we're going. Now let's do a quick job here. Just have a little piece of the veneer that we clipped off from the outwale, the trim along the edge of the boat. Just that short little piece. Well, you should have 4 of those actually. And we're going to make a little called wood flower. And I'm using a nice sharp piece of sandpaper because I don't have to work too hard. And this is the 80 grit will work great for this. And just don't sand the tips of your fingers too much. Sanding the side is easier than sanding the end. It goes quite a bit faster. Sanding the end doesn't seem to work all that well. And we're just making enough wood flour here to color the resin, thicken it a little bit, color the resin for filling in at the trim for the drake tail where we had little gaps. Not really a strength thing. Just and you could just varnish over it and ignore it, but it'll look better if we fill it in. You could use phenolic powder, which is kind of similar in tone, but not identical. This will blend in better. This wood flour made from the same wood as we're filling in, so you should have a pretty perfect match there. Okay, not much left there, and just a little bit more. Okay, let's go with that much. I'm just going to dump it into my mixing pot here. That should be plenty. We're just doing a couple of drops of resin here. Well, more than a couple. I don't mind having a little extra. Let's do 10 drips of resin. And I want to show you how to do drips of resin because people have trouble with this. And I used to have trouble with it too. So use your resin syringe. Make sure you got the resin syringe. Clear resin. And we can go right on top of the wood. There's 1 drip. And we can probably get 2 drips. But hold that. Don't just push on the plunger. Hold your thumb underneath it. So we got 2 drips there. And then we're going to pull more in there. And there's a 3rd drip. And a 4th drip. And then we're going to pull more in. There's a 5th drip. Let's go for 10. 6 drops. Pull more in. 7 drops. 8 drops. Pull more in. 9 drops. And 10 drops. I'm going to show you what happens if I try to get more than 2 drops out of there. All of a sudden it squirts out. It's very hard to get that 3rd drop out. So just keep dipping it and get 2 drops at a time. Okay, and hardener. Now we need 2 drops of hardener. We're going to be switching to our other hardener jar soon, but I think I can get 2 drops out of here. Make sure that it's not a bubble. You don't want a bubble drop full of, just there's 1 big nice solid drop. And there's the 2nd solid drop. Okay, so we should have exactly the right 2 to 10. If anything, those hardener drops were a little bit bigger, which is always it's good to be on that side of the equation rather than, you don't want to, it doesn't make it stronger or anything. It really just makes it weaker if you have too much hardener. But if you're short of hardener, it doesn't set up quite as well. So don't be short of hardener. Try either exactly the right mixture. I'm just going to use a mixing stick. This is just from the narrow edge piece from one of the from number 6, I guess. Rather than use a brush for a small amount, the brush would absorb most of what I'm mixing, and you wouldn't have much left. Okay, and we're mixing that right in the powder, right on top of the powder that we made, the wood flour. And I think if it starts getting pasty too thick, then don't put any more flour in. And spreading that right into, pushing it down, working it down into those crevices at the top, at the back. Let's turn this so you can see maybe a little bit better. Then we can give you a bit better view there. So working it right down, and we'll sand, of course we'll sand off the residue on the surface again. Now this is, you'll notice this looks dark. It's like, well, wait a second, it's the same wood. Why is it darker? Well, the rest of the wood will turn dark to match when we put a varnish on it. Just like, you know, if you want to check and see what color it'll look like, you can just take a little bit of it and wet it, and you'll see how it darkens it. So any place you can see a gap, just spread your wood filler. A bit of a real narrow gap along here. I think I could ignore that, but I won't. And of course this is a strength thing as well, although it really was pretty, it was very well, you know, glued and quite strong. And if when this sets up you're not totally pleased with it, just do the same thing a second time. You can go over any of the joints if you think there's a little gap. But you may as well wipe off any excess rather than having to sand it off. It's always my preference to wipe surfaces clean rather than having to sand them clean. Although in this case, wiping it with a paper towel or something, I think would probably remove too much of your resin. So I'm gonna, and I've quite a lot of. I mean, that 10 drops was. I probably used a tenth of that. I probably used, well, maybe more than 1 drop. I didn't use much though. Quite a lot left in my container. Okay, and especially make sure you wipe off any epoxy where it's going to be hard to sand, like underneath the edge here. You're not trying to wipe it off totally clean. You're going to sand it. You just don't want to have to do more sanding than necessary. If you try to wipe it off totally clean, you may find that the epoxy settles in a little bit, is absorbed partly by the wood, and all of a sudden your gap is no longer filled at the top surface. So leave a little buildup on the surface to let in, so your wood can pull that epoxy down into the gap if the epoxy in the gap starts to sink down a little bit and get absorbed. It'll be easy enough to sand this off. So I'm just adding a little bit back onto the surface because I don't want to have to recoat this. I mean, it's not a big deal, but may as well do it in one go. Okay. And there. I think we got it. Perfect. So little details like that are so easy, and that's what really can make the difference between a sort of museum quality model and, you know, just a functional model that's beautiful and fun but not quite as precise. But a little detail like that, it's very easy to do. You do have to know about the wood flower trick and everything. And remember, we used clear epoxy there, not pre-thickened, because the pre-thickened is a little bit, has a white tone to it, and probably would not blend in quite as well with the wood tone, even with the wood flower in it. Okay, there we go. Done. Okay, there you can see it from above. And again, we'll sand off most of that and just leave what's down in the grooves between the pieces. Nice job. Okay, now you can see we have coated the epoxy, coated the mahogany much more thoroughly than we want it coated in the end, but that'll sand, it's a thin coating, and we'll sand that off and it'll come out looking very, very clean and neat with no grooves, and then when we varnish it, it'll be absolutely gorgeous. So you can see, and that's kind of the difference between a real quality, museum quality finished job, and you know, a nice quality, but not quite as perfect in every detail. But that was very easy to do, and just takes a couple minutes. So it's definitely worth doing those little details. And if you have other places, that's a good technique to use the matching wood flour and fill any place. If you have a little gap in any of your butt joints, you can fill the same way. So just a little technique there that works very easily, and it's kind of fun and fast. Okay, now this is a fairly simple job, and so I think we can leave the Bach playing in the background because you're not going to have any trouble with this, except for one thing, the starting point. Let's look at our keel. See if we can figure out how this goes. Here we go. Here are the keel pieces. The inner pieces, like so, with the propeller shaft coming right down the middle. Now these are the outer pieces, the full ones. They go on the outside of the sandwich. It's like a sandwich. If you glue, we're going to glue, we've already glued, if you haven't done this, do it now. We're going to glue these two pieces. That's two laminations that we already glued together when we had some extra glue earlier. We're going to glue those two together, the small pieces, and these two together, which are smaller than these two pieces. We're not going to glue the big pieces together. If we glued those together, there's no way we can make the keel, because these are supposed to be the outside of the sandwich, the bread, in other words, of the sandwich. And these are the cheese, 2 layers of cheese here. And these again are, these pieces, like the small pieces here, are already 2 laminations of plywood. So when we glue these together, we'll have 4 laminations, and same with these. And at the same time, we're going to glue together the inner pieces of the rudder. The inner pieces have the slot cut in them. Maybe you can see that there. The slot cut in it for the rudder shaft, which will come down, do a 90-degree bend, and fit in that slot nicely. Okay, so make sure you don't do anything with these outside bread pieces of the keel at this point, because if you glue those two together, you're stuck. And I don't know if there's enough extra scrap plywood to make new replacement parts for those. Okay, and I have mixed up 1 large mark of pre-thickened resin with 1 small mark of hardener, and I have a fairly droopy mixture there, big sag, which is what I want, because I want it to brush on easily. This is all pretty straightforward, but on the rudder pieces, if you use heavy coating of epoxy, you're going to get a lot of squeeze out in the slot. You're going to have to file or sand that out of there. So this is a time to be discreet and use the right amount of epoxy, but not in excess, because it's just going to mean more work getting that slot clear again. Okay, so fairly thin on here. Should be able to see the wood grain through the epoxy quite clearly. And we are going to coat both sides, so don't do too heavy on one side, either side. And then, for clamping together, there are a couple of options. Weighting them is probably the best option, though, because when you weight them against a plastic underneath, so you don't glue them to your table, but when you weight them against a flat surface, you're going to come out with the 2 of them as a lamination will be flat, and the gluing will hold them flat. So that is probably optimal. Using the binder clips, might be an option, but I would say your rudder might not come out as flat if you use the binder clips, especially if you have any twists to your pieces. to start with. So I would suggest weighting them fairly heavily against the table, but the key is you have to be able to see the edges, or else they're going to skid and be off out of alignment, and that's no good. Oh, did I do the same? I did just what I should have warned you about. See that? That was a good demonstration, wasn't it? To show you how not to do that mistake. It's not really, doesn't really matter that much. But I did the same side of both pieces, so I can't glue them together. So, simple solution, I'll just take it off of this side, and I'm going to put it on. I'll try not to do that with these other pieces as well. Well, with these pieces, can we do it? Yeah, we could do it. We could do the same mistake with these pieces as well, with any of the pieces we're doing right now. So I'm going to be careful now. Okay, and I'll just take it off the rudder and put it on this piece. You see, it's brushing out pretty thin. That one large mark I think it'll do all of this if we put it on the right thickness. We'll see. See if we can get it all done. Okay. I'm supposed to screw a little right there where it's holding it. There. Okay, so we'll weight those in a minute, but I'm going to get this rudder put together right first. Okay, now I'll coat this side. So we have opposite sides, mirror images coated. You were probably watching me do that and thinking, hey, he's making a mistake there. Well, good job. Should have spoken up. Should have said something. So fairly thin coating. You may get a little bit. The reason we coat both sides is if a little bit soaks in, we don't want to have a dry joint. You don't want to have any place that is just too thin that won't be glued. Okay, but we have a little bit more on this piece than we do on this piece, so I did this second piece pretty thin. Okay, now we should be in business. Okay, I'm going to show you how we're going to weight that. Maybe just use this here. And I'm going to weight it so I can keep my slot visible. I want to keep the edges visible so I know I have alignment. I want to keep my slot visible too so I can clean it out if I need to before the epoxy sets up. So here we go. So you do it like that there. On the edges, if epoxy squeezes out the edges, I can sand that off easier than out of the slot. Okay, that looks pretty good. Check all the way around. Make sure you don't have any separation, any void where there's no epoxy coming out. If you have a little spot where you can't see a little bead of epoxy squeezing out, you probably don't have enough weight on there, or else you've used too little epoxy. There, okay, now I see a little squeeze out there. Okay, that looks pretty good. That'll be super strong. Doesn't take much epoxy to make it strong. Okay, and I have to remember to clamp these pieces. I'll just glue the mirror image inside of each of these pieces together, and we'll be done. And do we? Yes, we should have enough epoxy. If you're putting it on too heavily and running out every time I say we should have enough, mend your ways because you're just making more work for yourself. Because you're going to have a lot of squeeze out and sort of a messy cleanup and stuff. So you can do this where you can see it better. You can wait just a minute and we'll see if we have enough epoxy. Pretty sure we will. It's going to be close. Should be just right though. Hopefully. The biggest thing in this is getting an even coat everywhere, and you have to use reflected light to see how thick it is. If you're not using reflected light, you're not going to get an even coat. It'll look okay, you look straight at it, but it won't be even. The long skinny part's tricky. Okay, the mirror image, here we are. Now make sure you don't have anything underneath these on top of your plastic. Even a little chunk of something will make it come out not flat. Now this piece, I'm definitely going to weight this piece because it's not laying flat on the table. The table, make sure your table's flat. This may not be the flattest part of the table. So make sure your table is flat and then weight it. And the final lamination should come out flat. I'll move this over here where I know the table's flat because there's a little joint right there, which I think is flat, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay, there's that half. Now the mirror image, this half. And yes, this will be exactly just barely enough epoxy. Because this side is going on pretty thin. But that side has plenty. The first side actually has plenty for both sides. But if you don't coat both sides, you're risking having a little dry spot or a little void or something. So even though one side is pretty light, you still want to coat both sides. Now we're really scraping the bottom of the pot here, but it's going to work. And this does give you a very accurate sense of how much epoxy to use. It may be less than you would expect, but that was plenty for these glue jobs. You know, it's totally empty now, just a little bit. If you want a little bit more, you can scrape your brush on the edge and get that where you can reach it easily. Okay. But now the pot is totally empty. There's really no more in there. I couldn't do any more. Okay, but just the right amount. And flip. And line it up. Okay. And then a couple more weights. Not quite. These are not quite flat, so I'm not happy with that system there. So I want to get another support here and get my weight right where I want it. I'll put one right there. And a lot of, you can use a piece of wood weighted with a book or something. A book down flat will make it hard to see whether you have it all lined up correctly. So, but you could use a stick across and then put a book on the stick so you can still see the piece you're gluing. Okay, we're almost there. Just need to weight this piece here and get some weights on here and we'll be good. Okay, so I think you got to take your brush out of the pot and we're done. After we get those weights. Batteries would work well here too. Okay, here we are. And this is exciting. We are going to put together the keel and the propeller shaft. Moving right along with our building here. So doing great. Now, this is fairly straightforward, but you do want to do it carefully and get everything aligned correctly and positioned correctly. I think the starting point is to find your keel pieces. Now we have these. This is 4 thicknesses now. The small piece that's going to go just like so on top of the keel. This is the bottom edge of the keel here. This is the top edge of the keel along the hull shape, and the rudder shaft, the propeller shaft goes right through in the groove between these two pieces, the small piece and the large piece that you've glued together 4 thick. This is 4 thick as well. And then the faces will go on either side. This one, of course, underneath there. And it all gets lined up very precisely. when you glue it. And then we're going to weight it. You could use the binder clips, binder clamps to clamp it, but the advantage of weighting against a flat surface is you know that everything will come out exactly true. So I'm going to go ahead and weight it when it's all glued together. You might, it's a good idea to mock this up. Now, notice there's a little play in the propeller shaft up and down. If you leave that play, you might get a little bit of misalignment there. So what we're going to do is use a couple of little paper towel shims, and I've already cut this. I did try to cheat and use a paper cutter, and it didn't work very well with paper towel. So the best is just to use a regular pair of sharp scissors and trim a 1/4 inch wide piece of paper towel. That's going to lay in there. You don't want it too long because it's going to be saturated with epoxy and it'll be quite hard. It's easy to cut now, but it won't be easy to cut after it's saturated with epoxy. And then the shaft will go in, and then the second paper towel shim. And you think, well, paper towel, that's not going to hold up. Well, when paper towel is saturated with epoxy, it'll last forever. It's no longer paper towel, it's more like epoxy. And then the second shim, paper towel shim on the top side, and then the top half of the keel. And now you can feel that the just that little paper towel shim, the rudder post is firmly positioned there and doesn't move around. Okay, and from the top and bottom sides, the two wooden pieces are going to be pushing against the rudder shaft. So you don't need shims above or below the, well, now when we talk about above and below, it's confusing because we have it on its side. But you don't need paper towel shims on the sides that are controlled by the top piece and the bottom piece. Well, again, that's confusing because it's on its side, so we have a top piece and a bottom piece. But I think you're getting the picture. These two wooden pieces are pushed up against the rudder shaft, so we do not need any shims there. But in the sandwich part, we need to add the shims because the four pieces glued together here are a little bit thicker than the rudder, than the propeller tube is itself. Okay, now on the propeller tube, just as a safety measure, we're going to take the unscrew the nut at one end and take the washer off and slide the propeller shaft out of the propeller tube, and then put that washer and the nut back on, or else you're going to lose them. They're pretty small. In fact, don't drop it in the carpet if you have a big shag carpet. Okay, so now it's all back together there, so I won't lose my nuts. And here, it's probably a good idea to use something in the ends of these tubes. A little blue tape would be good. Here's our blue tape. And but we can't just wrap it on this end. One end we can wrap it around. That end's not even at risk really. It's so far away. And then squeeze. That'll be the end that goes into the boat in the end. But at the other end, let's be a little bit more precise. We want the propeller tube sticking out about 3/16 of an inch, just under 1/4 of an inch. More than 1/8 of an inch and just less than 1/4 of an inch. And the little, these propeller tubes may vary a little bit, but right now the mark at the end of the propeller tube where there's that close-fitting bearing surface added on is just about 1/8 of an inch from the end. So we'll just go a little bit beyond that and put our tape on as our marker. And that will be our marker. So we'll do it, we'll be taping this end, but before we tape that end, let's do one more thing. Let's put our propeller propeller tube in position, and our pieces of wood alongside lined up properly, and make a little black mark at the front edge of the bottom wooden piece. So rather than here, I made my mark way up there. Now, now we know what part is going to be glued in this operation, so we can rough it up a little bit. Epoxy and brass are not a perfect combination, you know, as far as real holding power, but this will be plenty. You know, there's so much surface area and everything that this will be very permanent. You'll never have problems with it. But it's good to rough it up a little bit. So there's actually a physical bond there, little grooves that the epoxy can get into on the surface. And I'm using, well, this is the 120. I might actually switch to the 80. It's probably even better. So here's the 80 grit, which will make slightly more aggressive grooves in the shaft. And I mean, you could sand the whole shaft, but the part going up inside the boat may as well be shiny and nice and smooth rather than sanded. And after sanding, we're going to wipe it down to get any grease or oil off of it. Even oil from your fingers can inhibit the epoxy slightly from adhering. Okay, so roughed up. You can see all those grooves. And you can wipe it down with regular rubbing alcohol. Probably more effective is using acetone. And so we'll go ahead and use acetone here on a paper towel. Acetone, you don't want to inhale, you don't want to breathe a whole lot of it, and you don't want to get it on your fingers very much, but this is a pretty quick operation here. So I don't think I'll have any problems here. So just wipe down the part that's going to go in our sandwich. There, looks good. If you don't have acetone or rubbing alcohol, I doubt you'd ever have any problem not doing that step, but I think it's still a good idea to do it. Okay, now we're ready to tape the end that's going to be sticking out at the back, and that's the 3/16 inch measurement. And if we get our tape on here right, that'd be nice. That'll be our guide. So 3/16, remember, it's not 3/8, it's 3/16, which is just over an eighth and less than a quarter. So get the tape on there. Acetone will also help the tape stick. Okay, the tape is not going to stick terribly well, but it doesn't need to. It's not holding anything. Just make sure you don't slide it and then get your position wrong. So check and make sure you can tell where the end of the shaft is. The end of the tube is. It's right here, and that's just. We can check that on a ruler. I may have it a little bit long. It looks a little bit closer to 1/4 inch than I thought. Yeah, well. I'm going to try to skid that out just a little bit. It's pretty close to 1/4 inch there. Actually, I think it might skid on the brass. That looks a little bit better. Okay. So yeah, we're right about 3/8 now. So I like that. Okay. So we've got our little tape protecting. The real thing is, the real point of the tape, well, it's nice to have a marking thing on there too. But the real point is to keep epoxy out of the tube. You do not want epoxy inside your rudder tube, propeller tube. That could cause a problem. You'd have to drill it out, I guess, and that is something you want to avoid having to do. Okay, there we go. Okay, now we're pretty well set there. I've also got my rudder pretty much ready. In preparing these pieces, make sure this is the time to sand off all the excess epoxy on the edges, especially in the groove where the propeller shaft is going to go on those edges. But it's just easier. It's going to be hard to sand after you've got this propeller tube glued in. So sand all the edges, and clean it all up really nicely down to the so you don't have any excess epoxy bumps or anything sticking out on any of the surfaces. And of course on these pieces, take the tabs off, and on the rudder, sand all the way around, of course, and then sand out the slot, and that's relatively easy as long as you haven't gotten too much epoxy in it, just with a folded over piece of like the 80 grit, until your shaft with the L bend in it, your rudder shaft, fits into that. If it's snug, that's good. A snug fit is nice there. And then on the rudder, if we're going to do that at the same time, we've got these pieces. This is 2 pieces thick. Remember, we laminated that. And we've got the rudder shaft. Now they're the 2 faces of the rudder that we need, and those are still in the deck here. So I'm going to take those out. I'm going to take them out carefully because I want to preserve the deck's integrity as far as this inclusion in it, so that the deck will be stiff enough to support the hull. Although if we've done a veneer deck overlay on it, we will have well, let's see, the veneer deck overlay, oh, to think this through, I can't remember if we've taken that out or not, but we'll get back to that. So let's use a knife to cut these pieces out instead of popping them out, because we're less likely to damage. So see, we'll just take out what we need, which are the rudder faces, and there, these pieces here. In cutting these tabs, you may as well cut them right against the rudder face instead of in the middle, because then you won't have as much sanding to do to get the tabs smooth. Okay, and then those will fall right out easily. Okay, and we still have a pretty intact center piece there. Okay, set that aside. And quick sanding, and again, sanding against a piece of sandpaper rather than sanding the, holding the piece. I mean, you can do it either way, but sometimes it can be just as easy rubbing it against the piece of sandpaper on a flat surface. Okay, there's one. Then we're going to start with 2 full marks, 2 large marks of pre-thickened, and 2 small marks of hardener, and we'll get those mixed up and start to glue this together. Now we'll want to coat all our surfaces, so we'll start, and on these faces, it's quite easy to coat the wrong side, so let's figure it out, and that's the way it's going to be laid up, and a pencil mark like an X on the side that you're putting the epoxy on is probably a real good idea, because I actually did that on the rudder. I coated the wrong side of one of the pieces and then had to scrape it off, and while it was still wet, it comes off easily enough, but it's easier just to do it right to start with. Okay, now I want to be careful, because if I'm going to clamp this onto the table surface or weight it down onto the table surface, I'd rather not have a lot of epoxy on the table underneath it. So, wipe that up. We're going to mess just a little bit of epoxy there. Okay, and continue coating. Now make sure you don't get any inclusions, like a little chunk of wood or something. into this, because that would hold the pieces apart, and they wouldn't actually mate together as tightly as they need to. So I've got a little splinter right there. I'll get rid of that. There we go. You want to use adequate epoxy, but you don't want it squeezing out all over the place. And since we're coating, it makes a big difference when you're coating both sides of a piece. Remember, you're getting twice as much epoxy in the joint as if you're only coating one side. But it's always a better policy to coat both sides when you're gluing things up. It just tends to mean that you'll have enough epoxy everywhere with no voids or gaps. In case you hadn't, watch out for hairs too. Even a hair is going to hold your pieces apart a little bit more than you want them to be held apart. And on the these pieces are pretty delicate at the front edge, it's the front end, so don't abuse them. Be gentle. Okay, there we are. Okay, so we're ready to start laying it together. Here we go. That piece, everything should line up perfectly. And I'm going to add my paper towel now. Okay, my first piece of paper towel. And I'll saturate that. Remember, any extra epoxy here is going to squeeze up around the shaft. It's not a problem. So saturate the paper towel quite thoroughly. Now, we have our groove for our rudder shaft ready. And we're going to go ahead and coat the remaining surfaces before we put our rudder shaft in, because we'll use some thickened epoxy on the rudder shaft. It's a big enough, since it's a round shaft in a basically rectangular square hole, the pre-thickened isn't really all that thick and might tend to run out at the ends more than we want to, because we want it to be solid epoxy around the rudder tube. We don't want any airspace. So the pre-thickened might run out the ends because it's somewhat thickened, but it's not really very thick. And so we'll add phenolic powder to it, but we don't want phenolic powder, especially in the gluing surfaces, just in the aperture where the rudder propeller tube goes. And so far, two mixture looks pretty good. We might be a little short though. We'll see how it goes here. If you go overboard with spreading this epoxy on these mating surfaces, you're just going to have a lot of cleanup because it's going to squeeze out. If you have too much squeeze out right along the edge where the rudder shaft is, where the propeller tube is, sorry, it's going to be a bit difficult to clean it off around the rudder, around the propeller tube. So you want to be somewhat discreet in the amount of epoxy you use, especially right around the rudder tube, both front edge and back edge, propeller tube. I thought I had these surfaces all cleaned off really nicely, but there was a little bit of a lump of hardened epoxy on that, right on that edge there, that I must have missed when I sanded the flat surfaces. And I didn't want that left on there, so I hit it with sandpaper and took it off, because I want this, I don't want anything holding these pieces farther apart than they're supposed to be. It's all carefully engineered to be exactly right. There. Now I've got my first piece of paper towel is in the groove, and everything's pretty well lined up. We're just starting to get it looking right. There, that looks good, pretty good. Okay, and this bottom piece looks good. A little more alignment up here. Okay, and now before we add phenolic powder, we're going to coat the rudder tube, propeller tube, with the pre-thickened. Thin coating though. We're not trying to build up, we'll probably get better adhesion with the pre-thickened before we add the phenolic powder is all. There. And now we'll add phenolic powder to what's left. There's not very much left. We might see if we can do it with this much. Let's see. Because we don't want a lot of extra. That's for sure, because it'll just make a mess and be hard to clean off around the edges. So we're just putting a little bit of phenolic powder in, just it's like a fifth of a spoonful. We don't want a pasty. We want a non-sag, but not pasty. So there, that looks just right, non-sag. Sagging a little bit, but not much. Now let's see if we've got enough to fill. I think we're going to have to mix another one. And we want to do our rudder at the same time, so yeah, we definitely need a little bit more for this to finish this part. I think we'll mix 1.5. That'll give us plenty for this and the rudder. If it's really warm where you're working, you might not have time. I'm working, it's about 50 degrees in here, it's kind of chilly. So if it's really warm where you're working, you might want to divide this up and just mix a teensy bit more at this point to finish the keel, and then mix a separate amount for the rudder. So I think 1.5, because we have the whole rudder to do as well. You will find that when you mix a second batch and you're using the same brush, the brush actually retains quite a bit of epoxy. So when you're mixing a second batch, your brush is already full of epoxy, so you don't have to mix enough to provide, to fill the brush again. Also, the container, it's hard to clean the container out entirely, so you get some residual epoxy in the container as well. So 1.5 small marks of hardener. I'm going to pull it all the way up to 5 marks, and then I'm just going to squeeze out 1.5. There's 1 and there's the half. And then the rest goes back in the container. I don't trust the bottom mark as being quite as accurate, depending on how you stuck on your measuring markers. And now before I add phenolic powder, I want to saturate my second piece of paper towel because it's not going to saturate as well with the phenolic powder. The other thing I really want to do is coat my rudder surfaces. So I'm ready to, because once I add phenolic powder, it just doesn't spread quite as easily, and you don't get quite as good. Now on these I didn't mark them yet, so that's going to be that one underneath. And this one's going to be, I've got pencil lines on it, but that's okay. They will erase and never show. So this one's going to be this side, it's going to be the epoxy on that side. Okay. Now for the front edge of the rudder, we need a little shim, and so rather than take something and have to sand it down very much, might as well take the thinnest piece of connecting piece out of your part sheet. This one came out of part sheet, so we can tell what part sheet number that was, 6. Okay, so we took this little shim, this little teensy piece here, see if I can get it up and show you. This little piece here was just one of the little connecting in between bits from sheet number 6, and we sanded it, not very much because it was pretty thin to start with. So it's 1/16 inch thick, which is the thickness of the plywood, by 1/8 of an inch. So it's just the thickness of the plywood in one dimension and twice the thickness of the plywood in the other dimension, because it's going into the front edge of the rudder, right where the as part of the inner sandwich. Now you don't want that to be too thick, because then it'll hold the rudder faces apart. So having it too thin is probably better than having it too thick, actually. I've got it pretty good. Maybe a little bit thick, but I think it's about right. Okay, now we're ready for our phenolic powder, and it looks like we'll have just the right amount of resin. Working quickly, because we don't want any of our parts to set up. And again, if it is warmer where you're working, you do better to do this in separate projects, or to have your rudder pieces further, more prepared. Okay, now we got another mixture where there's really not much sag there. Eventually it might sag a little bit, but there's not much sag. And we're going to fill this rudder. Think in terms of, okay, it's a round shaft you're putting into a square space. You want to fill in around the shaft, but you don't want a huge amount squeezing out at the ends where it'll be hard to clean off. Okay, our paper towel shim is in there on that, in the groove already, and here's our second shim, which we'll have to position more carefully here. And here's our propeller tube. Slide that down into place and push this piece back in. And let's get our second piece of paper towel shim on top of the propeller tube here. Nice. There. That's right. Okay, and that did look like about the right amount of phenolic powder fill in there. It's squeezing out a little bit. Let's put it together. I think we might get a little more squeezing out than we want, but not too much. Okay, like so. And looking pretty well lined up. Now is a good time for gloves, though, because I want to handle that. And there are other ways. I mean, you could just push up other things against it, but I think we're going to get the best alignment with our fingers, pushing it together with our fingers. So let's get some gloves on. Remember, if you're going to work with epoxy for, a number of projects, you don't want to get it on your skin, really ever, because some people get sensitized to it relatively easily. And then once you're sensitized to it, you don't work with it anymore. You just can't. Okay. Now, some of that phenolic powder mixture is squeezing out a little bit more than necessary. So I'm going to have a little bit more cleanup than I really ideally would like. But as long as I put my weights in a place where I can still clean it up. And this is working much better to use gloves here, so I can press everything into place and make sure we have good alignment everywhere. Okay. Good, and that's feeling pretty good. Okay, let's get weight on here. Do it this way. Now in weighting it, if you're doing weights, make sure you can still see the alignment, because epoxy is like grease. It just is super, very, very slippery material. And things tend to stay aligned until you turn your back, and then they all skid out of place. Okay, we'll do it this way. And you get creative. The big thing is to be able to clean it out and clean it off. And because once this is hard, it's going to be hard to clean off. Up against the rudder tube. Everywhere else you can sand it pretty easily, but against the rudder tube it's going to be hard to clean off. Okay, so both ends against the rudder tube are the same thing. And then as soon as we get the excess cleaned off here, we're going to check everywhere. I think I've got a little bit, yeah, this piece isn't, these pieces, I need a little more weight right here at the skeg, because it's not quite touching. It's lifting off a little bit. Okay. And make sure you have plastic on your table. Don't have any holes in your plastic. It could be a mess. Okay, the front ends, I can just see the front end here, so I can see that's lined up. I can look underneath a little bit and make sure everything looks tight. And all looking good except for right back here, the very back end of the skeg there. And I'll put another weight on there. Okay, looks like we got just the right amount all along here. Very nice, and we've cleaned off pretty nicely around the rudder shaft. I might hit that with a paper towel though, just because I like doing as little work as possible. And it's so easy to take epoxy off while it's wet, and so much harder once it's set up. Okay, and that looks good. You can, probably not a bad idea just to check and make sure that your rudder tube looks centered, but it has to be centered as long as those paper towel shims stay in the right place. So that would be the only consideration there. And now I'm weighting the very back corner, and that looks okay. That's all tight now. Very flat table surface. No wrinkles in the plastic underneath it that would make it tend to be warped. And now I can move on to my rudder. Doing great here. Where's my phenolic? Right here. Okay. And I'm going to zoom in on this because it's pretty detailed. Getting that rudder exactly right. So I want you to be able to see it. This is where it's difficult. Filming and using epoxy. I've got my gloves are a little sticky, but I'll be careful. Here, okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty good right there. You can see all that creative clamping. I wanted the weight to be on the ends of those pieces, here and here, so I propped up one end and brought them down. Okay, and now the rudder pieces. You can see the little shim. See if you can see at that angle, the little shim in front. I think that I may have that just a little bit too thick. I think I've got this piece just a little too thick. This is going to be messy as heck to sand it now that the epoxy's on. It would have been better to sand it before the epoxy was on it, but I think I can still sand it. It's just going to mess up my sandpaper a little. It's almost right. Just it's a little bit high, and I'd rather have it too thin than too high, because if it's too thin it'll just fill in with epoxy. If it's too high it'll hold my whole rudder apart and won't go together right. So that's something I could have checked a little bit more carefully before I had everything covered with epoxy. That's probably good there. Yeah, it's definitely better. Okay. I think we're pretty good now. Okay, and then the phenolic fill, and if you're doing this in the same sequence as I am, you should be coming out just right. Actually, I have plenty of phenolic here for this. You want to put the phenolic in before your shaft is in place, or else you probably have some voids around the edge of the shaft. Okay. Rudder shaft. You know, it's probably technically a good idea to rough it up where it's in the rudder. But don't rough it up above the rudder, because where it comes out of the rudder, you want it to spin smoothly. You don't want it to be a rough surface in the rudder tube. And I may have roughed it up a little bit higher. I just hit it a little quickly there. But I think we'll be okay. I didn't do much. Yeah, it still looks pretty smooth. And don't get epoxy on your rudder shaft either, because you'll have to chip that off later. And that's a nuisance. So acetone will dissolve epoxy. And you know, when it's wet, won't dissolve hardened epoxy, of course. And acetone will take off any oil residue on the stainless steel and give you a much better bond. Same with the rubbing alcohol, essentially. Okay, working quickly here. Okay, push the shim. Sticky. This is where gloves are pretty important. Okay, and again, making sure there are no inclusions, no chips of wood or anything on your faces, because then it wouldn't, just that a thin piece of wood fiber or something extra would hold things apart. Out of alignment, and that's looking pretty good. Again, this is a nice place for gloves, because being able to squeeze it with your fingers is the best way to align things. Okay, and weights. And again, you could use paper clamps on this, but again, I'm inclined to do it with weights against a flat surface. The only thing with weights is you have to make sure that one skidded it just a little bit. I didn't have it quite. Oops, it wants to skid again. I wonder if this may not be secure enough. Let's use this. Okay, that's looking good. Now, and one more weight on the other side, if I can fit that in, and I think we'll be good. But don't walk away without checking everything, and really, you're going to find if you don't come back and check it in 5 minutes, it might work this time, but sometime you're going to come back after it's set up and find that, oh my gosh, it's skidded out of place, and now it's a bit of an issue what to do with it. So so we'll get this together. Here we go, and then we'll come back and check it in a few minutes and make sure it hasn't skidded. Oops, that just skidded. Okay, that looks like it's staying still and all tight. The real trick is look at it carefully now rather than waiting till it's all set up to look at it carefully. When it's all set up, don't look at it that carefully. Look at it really carefully now. Because once it's all set up, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So inspect from every possible angle. Make sure there are no voids. And make sure all the pieces are exactly, precisely lined up. Make sure your rudder propeller tube is sticking out the right amount. at the front end, at the back end, with just over 1/8 of an inch, less than 1/4 of an inch. That looks good. And if more of the phenolic epoxy mixture has squeezed out, and I do have a little bit more I can clean off, go ahead and make sure you clean that off while it's still liquid. And you see how important that blue tape is at this point, because the epoxy is right up around to the back end of that. Okay. Very nice. And that was just the right amount of epoxy. We have just a little bit left in the container. You know, just barely half a brush full. But I'll clean out the container so it's good to use next time as well. A real quick step. Since we had some of the extra phenolic powder mixed up with that nice, pretty much non-sag consistency, I went ahead and filled in the little gap at the back of the drake tail. When you fill with epoxy, it's usually best to overfill it just slightly. So you can see, you know, I really have more of a buildup than I need there. But it tends to sink in, and if you fill it exactly right and smooth it off, you come back and you'll probably have a bit of a dip, and you'll have to fill it again. So usually it's easiest to fill it just a little bit high and then plan on sanding it down smooth. The phenolic powder, even in the pre-thickened, the phenolic powder sands pretty easily. Okay, so that's what we did with the excess epoxy, and if I put the boat right way up now, that would probably sag out. So I'm going to leave it upside down until that sets up there on the drake tail. Okay, and tomorrow we might clean up our workspace. We have an awful lot of tools and things spread around. However, it's all fun, and we're having a great time building this beautiful boat. Good night. Okay, we have a few things going on today. Here's our keel piece with the rudder tube mounted in it, and we've cleaned that up. Cleaned up all the edges so they're nice and square. Around the rudder tube, hopefully you got that fairly clean while the epoxy was still liquid. But I did find there was a little bit of a ridge along the edge of the rudder tube. So I used a little mill file there to file that out. Don't be too aggressive and sand through the rudder tube. That brass is fairly soft. So you can clean that up a little bit just with the edge of the file, the corner of the file. You can probably use sandpaper if you don't have a file handy, but the file is probably a little bit more precise. Of course, the other option is just make the slot in the hull a little bit wider to allow for that little sort of ridge along the edge there. But it's nice if you can get that a little bit cleaner. So a little work there, and then the rest is, I could file this a little bit more, or you could use sandpaper in here. The rest is all cleaned up there, and then we've done a rounding on the bottom, sort of a bevel. It's flat along the very center line for a little less than 1/4 of an inch wide, and then the edges are sanded to a round. When you do anything like that, any sanding like that, you can tell how good it is by feel. There's a little bit of a ridge right in here, and I could hit that quickly. This is the 120 grit, and because with your finger, you can feel things that you can't see. That feels smooth now. You can feel something, you know, a blemish of, you know, less than 1/1000th of an inch with your finger. A little bit hard there. When it's in the wood, you can't see any of these issues. But when you get a glossy paint on there, the light reflecting will show up everything. Anything that you can. But if it feels smooth and even with your fingers, then it's going to look smooth and even with glossy paint on it. Okay, so we've done this. and cleaned it up around the back end. Round chainsaw file works nicely in this area. I'm going to work a little bit more on that. That's not quite as smooth as I wanted yet, but it's getting pretty close. And then on the rudder, we've done some shaping, and that's going nicely. You could use the rudder square, but it wouldn't be nearly as efficient a rudder. So it's nice to shape your rudders fairly easy, because you can see as you shape it, you can see the lines of the different laminations in the plywood starting to expose themselves. So the trick there is to keep checking from side to side, and hopefully those laminations are exposing themselves an equal distance forwards as you sand. And on the back edge, it doesn't have to be a razor sharp edge. If you get it too thin, you'll probably start to change the shape of the rudder. And also you are more likely to have chips and dings, taken out of the back edge of your rudder. So just kind of, that's about a 1/16, a little less than a 1/16 of an inch square at the back end, and that's fine. And on the front edge, try not to sand through. I think I sanded through a little bit far right at one very, very small point where I can see the stainless steel rudder shaft, but it's fine, it'll be okay. But try not to sand through to your stainless steel rudder shaft. And then again, you're going to be feeling things that you can't see, so feel it really carefully. I think I have a little bit of a hard spot right there, right in here. So just a quick touch there. And if you use you can sand this all down by hand. It's going to be faster if you have some kind of power sanding system, a belt sander or something. But if you use a power sander, it's very easy to take off too much too quickly. So go at it be very careful, and you're going to be best off finishing it up by hand at least, because you'll get it smoother. And with power sander, you try to get it smooth, and you find you've taken off too much, and it's in one area and not enough in another area, and you keep going, you end up with no rudder. Okay, so we got the rudder ready, and all smooth. I can be smoother here. There's no limit to the amount of sanding you can do. Just don't change the shape of the rudder by sanding it too much. Okay, and that's ready. Now on the keel, we've cleaned it all up. I'll do a little bit more in here, but it's just pretty nice. The next thing that is somewhat optional, but it's a nice detail, it's pretty easy, is to do flow channels in front of the propeller tube, where the propeller shaft and propeller will be sitting. If you have the square edge, you're going to have a lot of turbulence there as the water goes past and then doubles back to fill in where it couldn't get to as it flowed past that area, past the back edge of the keel. So it's nice to do the flow channels, and it helps if you draw those in first. You don't have to stick exactly to your drawing, but those are sort of parabolic shapes. Remember, you want your flow channels to be the center line of the flow channel, the parabola. You want that to be the center line to be lined up with the bottom edge of the keel, because the water, not with this top edge. The water's going to be flowing parallel to the bottom edge of the keel, like so, and not flowing up at this angle so much. Although you can there might be right underneath the hull, there might be a little bit of flow at that other angle. So on this top one, we'll sort of split the difference a little bit. The top one really can't be as deep as the bottom one. Okay, so those are pretty light pencil lines. Might be hard to see, but they're basically parabolas, and we'll sort of aim for that. It doesn't hurt to put a center line on the back. I mean, you can also go by the number of layers of lamination that you've gone through. and but don't go past, don't sand through your center line on either side. Now there are a few tools that can work. One is just, well, one is your finger, and just sanding with the 80 grit's probably the most appropriate to start with because you're trying to remove a lot of wood. You can also use this looks like might have been a broomstick once, but a large diameter dowel, and wrap the sandpaper around that. That'll be a little bit faster to take it down and try to get more even results than your finger. So that's another approach. And you can see just in that few seconds of sanding, well, maybe you can see, you're starting to create the channel that you're aiming for. Another approach, which is going to be more aggressive, and you don't want to use this approach solely. You can start and do the, rough it out with wood rasp like this, curved rasp, curved surface on that side. But this will take a lot more wood off a lot faster. But you'll want to finish up with the sandpaper because this will leave a pretty rough surface. And if you're going to go with this approach, don't go too far, don't go too deep, because it moves the wood pretty quickly. The wood rasp probably is slightly more efficient, but if you don't have one, just use sandpaper, 80 grit. You could probably even go to a slightly coarser, like 60 grit, but the 80 grit will work fine. Another approach is the Dremel tool, and I think probably the most appropriate fitting on the end, or tool on the end to use in the Dremel, is one of the little sanding drums, a fairly coarse grit sanding drum on the end there. And if you have the flex shaft, I almost never use my Dremel without the flex shaft extension on it, because it makes it so much more convenient. It's just a much easier, more delicate tool holding this end than holding the whole motor end. Okay, so let's do this quick. And I value my eyesight, so I would not even demonstrate this without eyeglasses, safety glasses. So anytime you use a motorized tool, you should always have safety glasses. So this would do a fairly quick job on it too. Okay, so you can see how we're moving along on that. Any one of those approaches, I don't want to use the Dremel too much because I don't have a mask on, and it's hard to talk with a mask on. So, and it makes enough dust, mixed epoxy and wood dust, that I don't like to breathe. So if you're going to use the Dremel, do it either outdoors with a good wind blowing, or else, and where you're not breathing any dust, or else wear a good respirator dust mask. Okay, so we're going to keep working on that. We'll make it wider and shallower than most of our pieces. Like this sanding drum on the Dremel. The Dremel is going to be too narrow and deep, so we would have to widen it out as we do the Dremel. So we'll work away at that, get that done, and in the meantime, let's look at the next step on the hull. And when we come back, I'll have this all shaped, and I'll show you how nicely those channels look. Again, on the channels, like on the rudder, you're using the different layers of the laminate, both the plywood's laminate and your laminations, to tell if you're getting an even shape and an even contour, sort of like a contour map there with the plywood. Okay, so the next step on our hull is exciting. Well, I think exciting might be the right word. We're going to put a hole in the bottom of our boat, and that's for getting ready for the rudder. We're going to attach the keel first because it's a little bit easier to get the keel perpendicular and true than it is with the rudder, because the keel doesn't turn sideways. But the keel position is based on the rudder position. So we do have to go ahead and start with our rudder process, because the keel wants to come right to the bottom of the rudder. So right like that, the back edge of the keel, the little skeg there, comes right to the front edge of the rudder. So we have to know our rudder position first before attaching the keel. So we're going to drill our hole in the bottom of the boat, so it's lined right up with the front of the rudder support column here. That's going to be hard for you to see there inside the boat, but let's see if you can get a better view of it. Okay, there's the rudder support column going down to the bottom of the boat, right there at the back edge. You can see it, and we're going to be drilling the hole right at the base of that, but forwards 1/8 of an inch from the base of the rudder support column. And we'll be drilling right to the bottom of the boat, and I think we can start on that here in a minute. Okay, so we're going to start with a 5/32 inch bit, and then we're going to enlarge the hole with a 3/16 inch bit, and we'll end up with a 1/4 inch bit. And we are drilling a hole for the rudder tube. The rudder tube is carbon fiber, 0.265 outside diameter and 5/32 inside diameter. And the final assembly will be the carbon fiber rudder tube with the brass sleeve inserted in it and glued in with CA. So that'll be the final version. And so we need a hole that is just barely bigger than 1/4 inch for the 0.265. But we can use a 1/4 inch bit and just sort of expand the hole with that. So now I've got that stuck in there. There. And so we're going to do a few preparatory things. We're going to take a piece of blue tape and stick it on the bottom of the boat, right where we expect that rudder hole. In fact, I'll run it. Let's see, where's that going to come through? Should come through right about here. I'll run the tape parallel to the center, right along the center line, parallel to the center line there, so I make sure I don't miss my tape. The tape is to keep the just to minimize the splitting out when you come through with the drill bit through the bottom of the boat with the drill bit. The key is to this is the 5/32 inch bit. The key is to drill. Oh, and with the 5/32 inch bit, in order to be able to reach the bottom, don't put it too far into your chuck. Just put it in the minimal amount into your chuck, or else you won't be able to reach all the way to the bottom of the boat. Okay, and now when we drill this hole, we want it to be right at the base of the rudder support column, but we want it to be in the center of the hole to be 1/8 of an inch forward. When we have our full-size hole drilled, a 1/4 inch hole drilled, we want the back edge of the hole to be lined up exactly with the front edge of the rudder support column. So the carbon fiber rudder tube will be up against the rudder support column and supported by the rudder support column. Okay, so here we go. So let's just do a little bit, check and see if you look pretty well centered, because if you haven't gotten into it yet, you can push move the bit sideways a little bit as you go. That looks pretty well centered though. This is, the more precise this is, it's just pleasing, but your rudder's gonna steer the boat no matter even if it's slightly off center. And probably nobody else will notice it except you. But that looks perfectly centered, actually. Now, you want to drill this with very little pressure and a high speed, so you'll get less chip out on the bottom. Okay, so now I'm on the high speed setting and very little pressure. Okay, there we go. And now let's check and see how well centered we are. You might be able to tell pretty well through the tape if you're well centered or not. It looks pretty good, but I'm going to remove my tape so I can check that, or at least partly remove it. Oh my gosh, that's perfect. Yeah, right on. Couldn't be better. Okay, and now I don't expect any chip out on the inside because there's an epoxy fillet in there. As long as we're drilling with speed and not a lot of pressure, we shouldn't chip the no wood grain in an epoxy fillet, of course. I'll leave my tape on the outside so I don't chip out on the outside. And I'm switching to my 3/16 inch bit. And if your hole isn't perfectly centered at this point, you'll be able to move it sideways a little bit as you drill through just by putting some sideways pressure on your bit as you drill. Now, the angle here, of course you don't want it tipped sideways. That would not be smart. But the angle wants to be lined up with the rudder support column. The rudder support column is slanting slightly forwards though. So I will try to mimic that angle by tipping my drill slightly forwards, slightly forwards. Very little pressure. Hopefully it was square. It's really just these first two holes. you can change the angle a little bit with your last hole as you drill through. And we are just right up with the 3/16. I'm just barely in front of that rudder support column, so I don't want to move the hole back any at all. See if I need to move it forward a teensy bit, but I think we're good. Okay, and then the last bit is the 1/4 inch bit. Oh, I said I was going to clean up my tools, and I didn't do it, did I? Now I can't find the bits. Oh, here, right here. If you're nervous about this step, don't worry. The epoxy can fill in. If you end up with a hole that's too big or off center, you can move your hole sideways and fill in with epoxy and everything. So epoxy makes all this. Epoxy will fix any carelessness here. Okay. That pulled in a little bit. I'm glad I had the tape on there because otherwise I think I might have split out the wood a little bit. But the tape kept the wood from splitting, and that's good. And let's see where we came out on the inside, and that looks just right. Yep, we're right along the front edge of that, right along the front edge of the rudder support column there, piece. And one tool, really not necessary for building the boat, but it is kind of a nice tool for modeling, is a chainsaw file. These small round, you can get different diameters, but what is this one's probably a 3/16 inch diameter. Yeah, maybe a little smaller than 3/16, but not too much smaller. Might be a, in fact I think it is 5/32 inch file. And it's nice for cleaning up. So I'm just cleaning up the hole a little bit and the front edge of the rudder column. This would be the best way to enlarge that hole, because remember we've got a 0.265 here, and we just drilled a 0.240 hole. with our 1/4 inch bit. So we're not quite there yet. It's pretty close. It's not that much different. Another way to open up that hole is just with your drill bit, just running it up and down in there. And that's another time when you could move the hole sideways if you needed to. And there we go. So that's pretty simple. You don't have to run out and buy a .265 drill bit. Okay, now we're making great progress, and that tube lies very nicely. Well, actually, I'm going to file just a little bit more, and again, I probably could use the drill bit for this, because it's not lying. It doesn't want to lie flat right across against the rudder support column yet. I could use the drill bit from the bottom or the file from the top there. And let's see what we've got. Okay, that lies perfectly flat against the rudder support column now. So we're happy with that. Actually, it still wants to pry itself out just a little bit. So just get the angle of the hole changed just a little bit to make it. Now, all this can be done with the 1/4 inch drill bit if you want, but the file's probably a little bit more precise and handier. It's easier if your carbon fiber tube is snug in there and holds itself in place, but it's not critical. The big thing is that it will position itself right against the front edge of that rudder support column. And it's still wanting to pull itself out at the top a little bit. So a little bit more. Okay, there, now we got it. That's going to be just fine. Remember, when you're fitting things, the way to get a perfect fit is to just take off a little bit and check it, and take off a little bit and check it, and then take off a little bit more and check it. If you try to do it all in one go, you're probably going to end up taking off too much. Let's get our brass tube glued into our carbon fiber piece. You know, as a precaution, you may as well rough up the outside edge of the brass tube so you get a good bond, good mechanical bond with the CA. So this is 100 grit, I guess, but 80 grit would be fine, or the 120, either one. It's not too critical. And you're doing two things here. You're sanding off the oxidation that automatically happens on metal almost instantly, and you're putting some grooves and a rough surface in that the CA will adhere to, can get in the grooves and actually stick to easily. Okay, I'm not sanding right to the very edges because I don't want the very ends to be roughed up, especially. I don't want CA on the very ends. Now, it's critical not to get CA into this tube as we slide it into place in the carbon fiber. I'm going to tape the very bottom. The brass tube is 1/16 of an inch longer, well, 1/8 of an inch longer than the carbon fiber tube, or it should be a little about that. So it can have a 1/16 of an inch extra at each end. So rather delicate taping to get the tape to stick. Oh, before we tape it, it's nice if you wipe it down with alcohol or acetone. Just take off any oil from your fingers or any contamination. So we'll wipe that down. Quick wipe. course, you can't see that you're taking anything off. There's nothing on there, but just a little residue of fingers tend to be oily or sweaty sometimes. And so now we have a clean surface. And so now our tape on the bottom end, it's very, very small. I mean, you just barely, just having as little of the brass tube covered up as possible here with the tape. Just the very least amount of brass tube covered as you can, so the tape just barely holds on there. A little fiddly here. Just get a new piece of tape. This is just to keep the CA out of the tube. That's the only point in this. Okay, now we've got something that'll work. Maybe just a teensy bit more than a 1/16 of an inch, but not much. I can push it down with my fingernail a little bit. Without the tape, it'd be awfully easy to get CA into the bottom end of the tube. So the tape, even though it's fiddly and might take several attempts, it's worth getting the tape on there. Okay? And then just squeeze the tape closed at the bottom. You don't need tape on the top because there won't be any CA in the tube, in the carbon fiber tube when we start. It'll just be on the brass tube, and we'll slide that up and in, so any excess CA will be coming out the bottom. So that's why we put tape on the bottom and don't need it on the top. Okay, and then the CA, and then I almost always have to use pliers to get these open. Now we want CA along the entire length of the tube, but just a thin amount, and we want to be fairly quick here. And we don't want the tube to be glued in part way. We want it to be all the way slid in. So don't pause part way in or something. Get it all the way in. Don't go all the way to the top end or all the way to the bottom end with your CA. Okay, and here it is. Oh, and so on the top just a little bit. And that's pretty good. Comes right up to the very top, sticking out the bottom a little bit more, but try not to glue your fingers onto the carbon fiber tube too. So that looks good. It went right up to where the tape is, and now we have a sleeve in there, and we'll let that set for a minute. It does definitely help with the CA to clean off the nozzle every time. Otherwise your top will get harder and harder to get free. And always screw the top all the way down so there's a metal pin in the top. You want that to go all the way down into the tip of the nozzle. Okay, so that worked out well, and then we can get our tape off there. Now you can see the brass is sticking out a fair bit below the carbon fiber tube. So when that sets up, I'm just going to sand that brass off. I can probably do it now. Okay. I'm going to sand that brass off so it's essentially flush. So sandpaper, that's working fine. Or another option would be your mill file. Probably be a little faster. With all these tools, there are different options. There's usually quite a bit of overlap in which tool is going to do the job and which tool might do it best and such. The big thing in this whole process has been to avoid getting any CA inside the brass tube. That might be a problem. Okay, and they're almost flush, not quite, so we pinch a bit more. And there we're pretty much flush there. And let's check and see how we did. That maybe a little bit of a burr. Oh, in getting your brass ready, before you put your put your CA onto the brass tube, in preparing the brass tube, take the end of the brass tube and rub it on like the 220 or 120 sandpaper. Make sure there's no burr on the end of the brass tube that's going to keep it from sliding into the carbon fiber piece. Make sure before you get your CA on that the brass tube is going to slide in easily enough. Now I seem to have a bit of a burr at the top, so it's getting a little bit difficult to push that out. If you have any problem, just take an 1/8 inch drill bit and clean out the inside of the tube with the 1/8 inch drill bit. Here we are. So 1/8 inch. You might be able to do this by hand, or you might have to put it in the drill. There we go. I think that was all it took, just like that. And that would clean out any CA that got in the tube as well. So not to worry too much about that. Okay, now you can see it all goes together nicely. This is actually a little bit, I'm getting a little extra resistance there at the top, so I might use that 1/8 inch bit again. You want a tight fit because you don't, this comes up above the water level, but in waves you don't want water squirting up there. Okay, now that's a nice smooth fit. Okay, so now we're making good progress. We can put our rudder in place, and we're just going to tape the carbon fiber tube in place on the rudder support column on the inside of the boat, and then we'll know where the front edge, the bottom corner of the rudder comes to, and then we can position our keel accordingly. Because the keel position fore and aft is determined by where the bottom front edge of the rudder falls. So a couple pieces of tape on the rudder tube. Once we get the keel glued on, then we'll glue this. Then we'll glue the rudder post in. It's going. You could do it the opposite way. You know, lining up the rudder so it's not tipped sideways, and then line up the keel with based on the rudder alignment. But the rudder is a little harder to line up perfectly because if you have it turned slightly sideways, it's going to be hard to see if it's exactly vertical. Whereas the keel piece, it doesn't. It's not. You don't turn it sideways. It doesn't want to turn sideways. You line it up with the center line, and it's either tipped or it's one way or the other way, or it's vertical. And obviously, what you're aiming for is to have the keel piece exactly vertical when the boat is sitting horizontal. Okay, so here's our rudder piece. That'll probably help with adhesion to wipe down your rudder support column either with alcohol or warm water or acetone. Because we are concerned that rudder tube be held tightly to the rudder support column, right along the front edge of the rudder support column. So I was having trouble with the tape sticking initially, so there might be a little bit of amine blush on that surface. Okay, but the alcohol will take it off. Now at this point we're most concerned about the forward and aft positioning of the rudder. rather than leaning sideways, although this is a good time to get a sense of whether your rudder support column is actually exactly vertical from side to side. So tape that tightly. Now my tape is sticking quite well to the surface of the rudder support column, and that rudder tube is back tight against at the top. It's tight against the rudder support column, so we're in good shape there. Flip, and I'll have to be a little delicate so I don't want to dislodge my tape, otherwise I'll have to redo that step. And on the bottom, maybe you can see, I don't know. Anyway, the carbon fiber tube and the brass tube are just barely proud of the bottom, by less than a 32nd of an inch. Okay, so this is where, there we go. Okay, make sure your rudder's going to clear everything. Okay, and that's our rudder position right there. Okay, now you can grab your keel piece, and this isn't in the instructions, but it can be a nice detail. I'm just putting a little bit of a concave dip in the very back edge of the little skeg, and then you can make sure that that's not going to impede the rudder. The rudder needs to spin 45 degrees each direction, and there, that's fine. And now, based on the rudder position, make sure your rudder is still being held firmly forward and aft. And then based on the rudder position, set your skeg in place and grab a pencil. And it's nice if the skeg is right up against the rudder there. And from the side, look and see where you need to make your hole for the rudder shaft. You'll be able to expand this hole if you don't get it exactly right to start with. But looking from the side, you can get it pretty precise. Get down as low as possible. Remember, the thickness of the bottom of the boat has to be allowed for. So I keep moving that forwards, and then this one. Okay, so my initial marks were too far back. I didn't have a good angle, but once I got the right angle, I think I can tell right where those marks need to be. So I'll erase my marks that I think are wrong, and go with the marks I think are right. Just double check those now that I just have one set of marks. And it's not a tragedy if you get this wrong. It's just easier to get it right the first time because you can correct it. But that looks good. And now, remember that rudder tube is 1/4 of an inch wide, so we want 1/8 of an inch on either side of that. On either side of the center line. So 1/8 of an inch there, 1/8 of an inch there. Sharp pencil, my pencil's not as sharp as it should be, but sharp pencil allows a much higher level of precision. And so now I'm just drawing that little box onto the bottom of the boat where I'll cut out for the propeller shaft to go through the hull. That looks good. Now, let's make a mark at the front and back end of where the keel will fall. The back edge. And this should be about the front edge right about here. Get it in place there. And life's going to be simpler if we do a bit of a flat along here. It doesn't have to be as flat as the whole width of the keel. You definitely don't want to sand through into the inside of your boat. So we're just going to flatten it for a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch here. You're going to have to sand all your marks off for where you're going to cut through. I could use a coarser sandpaper here. So that's flat for a little less than 1/4 of an inch, close to 1/4 of an inch, and we can make that a little more precise when we get the slot cut. I just wanted a little flat right where I'll be drilling through here, because it's easier to get the drill bit started if it's not starting right on the crest of a ridge. Okay, and again, we'll do best with a series of drill bits, and once again also let's use tape so we don't split out. Now this is going to be a little harder to see exactly where to drill once we put the tape on, so I'm going to make a mark on the side and then come across, and then I'll make a mark on my tape. Right about there is the back edge of the hole. That's not my drilling mark, that's the back edge of the hole. I'll make my drilling mark 1/8 of an inch further forwards, because I'll end up going, the final drill hole will be with a 1/4 inch bit. Okay, so I'm just moving my marks sideways back to the center line. But the tape is good. It's a very simple way to keep things from splitting out, and just makes a nicer job. So again, we're starting with our 5/32 inch bit, and also again, I forgot to mark the center of the hole. If you don't mark the center of the hole and you get excited here, you might end up drilling the center of the hole at your outside, where the outside edge of the slot should be, and then your slot's going to be wider than necessary, longer than necessary. Okay, and you're going to have better luck if your boat is sitting horizontal flat, just because if it's at an angle, it's hard to know if you're drilling square or if you're drilling it at an angle. So getting it sitting square is a good starting point. You're getting it all lined up. You can see, you'll be able to tell better than I can if I'm drilling straight through. Okay. So I have a block across halfway forwards on the boat, so it's supporting both gunnels, and that's sitting fairly flat there on the table. And now I'm drilling through here at my mark, the mark that's indicating the center of the hole. Okay, and the forward mark indicating the center of the hole, not the forward edge of the slot. Center line, good. Okay. And you can check, make sure those holes look lined up, because you'll be able to squidge them sideways a little bit if you need to, as you enlarge the hole with the next size bit. They look pretty well lined up. I think I might be off a little bit on this one. So we'll squidge them both sideways just a little bit. You're doing good though. They're very close. I think they're off. One's off one way. One's going sideways a little bit there. And this one's off the other way, so sideways a little bit. Right, okay. That looks pretty darn centered. I think we're good. Okay, and then the last bit, that was the 3/16 inch bit. And now we'll go up to the 1/4 inch bit. And if you can't tell which way they're off, they probably are perfect. And again, try not to let it just rip through the wood too fast. It's going to tend to want to pull itself in fairly quickly. So get some speed first before it can pull in. And I'm supporting my drill with my thumb here on the side to keep it from pulling in too. If it pulls in too fast, there's more tendency to chip out. Okay. Now you have a few options. You've got to make a slot between those two holes. One way is to drill a series of holes and then connect the holes. That may be the easiest. Another way, you could use a hobby saw starting in the hole. That's a little bit awkward because you don't have a lot of room to start in, but it would work. So that's another option. I don't think that's the best option though. I think drilling the series of holes. The other is to put a cutting wheel on the tip of your Dremel tool, on the end of the Dremel tool, and that's probably the easiest. But and then you just cut in. Those are just like an 1.5 inch round cutting tip. Okay, so I tried something new, and so you don't have to try it. It did not work well. I tried drilling, started to drill a series of 1/4 inch holes along my slot, thinking that would save some time. But the first one I started to drill just grabbed right away and split out a little piece of chunk out of the bottom. So that set me back about half an hour trying to gluing that piece back in, and I heated the epoxy up a fair amount on a light bulb, and then used a heat gun discreetly to set that off. So the whole process only took about half an hour to glue that back in, and that little chip. So not to do it with, do not start drilling with the 1/4 inch bit, because you'll probably experience the same phenomenon. Now we're going to retreat to a smaller bit. I would go with, if you have a 3/32, maybe I may as well even use a 1/16 inch bit. That's going to be the best, and totally safe. If it splits out with a 1/16 inch bit, I would be amazed. So now what we're going to be doing is drilling little holes right along our the edge of our line, just inside the edge of the line, where the edge of the box falls, and then we'll take that out a little bit. Then we'll be able to get those going as close as you can to each other without them skidding into each other initially on both sides. And then we'll merge those holes and sand it smooth. File or sandpaper, either way. So I don't know if you can see. Let's take a close-up look here. I'll bring it over to you. And okay, so now that's what we've got here. Okay, so this is what we've got here now. The split out there, that was, it doesn't really make any difference. It's all repaired with epoxy. It's just as strong as before, and it'll all be painted and totally invisible. Nobody will ever know. I'll forget about it in a few hours. It just wasted a little bit of time, is all. And now I've got the series of small holes drilled along there. I would have drilled them all the way forwards to my first hole, but because of the split out, I couldn't. So now we'll merge those by using the bit discreetly. 1/16 inch bit is easy to break, but we'll twist the bit in the hole sideways enough that it merges those holes together, and we should be able to get those pieces out of there. And so let's see if you can see this here. So now we're going to drill at an angle, all these holes. And then back at the other angle. This is instead of using the Dremel cutting wheel, which would probably be a little bit simpler, but not everyone has a Dremel tool. But if you have a Dremel cutting wheel, that's probably be my first choice. Now, you put too much pressure sideways on a 16th inch bit, it's going to snap the bit for sure. So do that gently and patiently, and then the piece will fall out. I did not break the bit there. But there's a good possibility for breaking a bit there. A file is probably the easiest thing at this point. Although sandpaper could be, you could wrap sandpaper around something thin and achieve the same results. Now, while my little repair there was setting up, I did have a chance to finish up my keel piece. And you can see these real nice channels for water flow are now all evenly sanded. If you haven't done that much woodworking, the only trick to getting things really smooth and even is a lot of hand sanding. If you try to do it all with Dremel tool, it's not going to come out all that smooth. You can rough it out with Dremel tool, but your fingers just can feel, through the sandpaper, your fingers can feel where it's not smooth, and so I used the curved wood rasp first to rough it out, and then I used the I think this actually was 100 grit, but 80 grit would be good. Sandpaper wrapped around the end of a broomstick, and that did really quite nicely. And then I went to 120 and 220. I probably used a 150 in between, but you could do it with 120 and then 220. And a lot of it's just feeling. Oh, that feels smooth. Oh, there's a little bump there. Let's sand that out. A lot of it is just looking at the different laminations. Let's take a look at that. And with plywood and your own laminations, it's real clear if you have a smooth surface or not there, because those laminations will just show it. And then also looking from the very back of the keel to see if the shapes, let's get that level, see if the shapes are similar on both sides. If you have if you have one side looking different from the other side, you probably want to sand them so they look even and balanced and symmetrical. Okay, and you can look at one side, the shape's there, and then flip it and look at the other side, and the shape's here, and you'll see they're quite similar, and that's achieved by looking at one side and saying, oh, that's not quite as, I haven't gone quite as far forwards on this side, so I'll sand that forwards a little more. And a real smooth, there's no bump there where where it merges, and that's from the hands, where no bump there where it merges into the channel, and that's from the hand sanding that you get any kind of bumps out. Okay, so that turned out really nicely, and now our hole is progressing. Probably going to need a little bit more filing. It's almost wide enough at the back, but not at the front. Now, if you have a round file, this works nicely. You can file forwards up underneath inside. See if you can see that. So what we're doing now is filing at this angle here, the angle that the rudder, that the propeller tube wants to lie at. Otherwise, you could make your slot a little bit longer, running forward farther. But this is a little bit more elegant with the round file, filing it to the right angle. And there we go. Look at that. Isn't that nice? So pleasing. Okay, now let's get our rudder in. And don't worry about any gaps. Don't worry about any gaps anywhere, because epoxy is just as strong as the wood and is a wonderful gap filling material. So let's put our rudder in and see how things are lining up. Now there are a couple of options here. Make sure our keel is all the way forwards. And then I think we have to move that slot forwards a little bit more to get our rudder. Let's turn our keel just a little bit sideways and see how we're lining up. This is where the final fitting is going to be slightly different. Rather than give you a measurement, you're going to find the final fitting is slightly different. Okay, we've got an overlap there of, spin this around, of a little less than 1/4 of an inch. Now, a couple of ways we can take care of that. Well, no, we want to move that forwards just a little bit more. We'll move our rudder to the front end of our propeller tube slot forwards about 3/16 of an inch, and then we should be in pretty good shape there. Okay, yeah, about 3/16 of an inch should do it. And again, this could be done with sandpaper. It's probably a little faster and easier with the round file, but there are more than one ways to skin a cat. Now on the inside, our propeller tube is not quite lining up. It's pretty close, but it's not quite lining up with the hole in, this is 6 in the 6th floor here. So again, I may have a little epoxy that got into that hole, but I'm just going to open that hole up a little bit again using the round file. So we'll get that hole a little bit lower, and then I think we've got a fit. Now we look like everything is lining up pretty well. Our rudder is free to spin. It's 45 degrees. The keel, there's a bit of a gap here right in the middle between the keel and the hull, but that's not an issue because that'll fill with epoxy. Our keel is center line. It's wanting to tip a little bit to one side, but not aggressively. And when we are ready to glue that in, we'll put a piece of tape across the top, and that should be able to hold it square. In fact, you might do a test run on that. Just make sure that the tape is going to work to hold that there. And yeah, that'll work fine. So we'll be taping it across the hull and then doing an epoxy fill underneath, and then we'll get our rudder tube glued in, and we will be in great shape here. Obviously the key thing now is two things. One, to have the keel on the exact center line at the front and at the back, and then to have the keel exactly vertical and not tipped one way or the other. So we'll get set up and get ready to do this next step, and we are going to have something beautiful here, looking good. Now, I probably shouldn't mention my mistakes, because then by the end of the build you'd think I was infallible and superhuman. But there is some benefit to builders if I mention some of my slip-ups. And there are two things that I have done that I decided I wasn't pleased with. One of them definitely had to be fixed, and the other I just wasn't as pleased as I wanted to be with it. And but the point is that virtually anything can be fixed with epoxy. So and it's as strong as it would have been if there hadn't been a slip up, and it'll never be seen anywhere you're going to paint the boat. We're painting the hull on this one. So the first slip up was I tried something new, which was probably not a good idea. I tried using a 1/4-inch bit, drilling a series. I used a graduated series of bits, drilling the front and back hole on the propeller slot, the tube, the slot for the propeller tube, and then instead of cutting corners, I decided to try a 1/4-inch bit to drill a series of holes in the middle. The first hole I drilled split out, and maybe you can see that little piece of wood that I had to glue back in there. But not an issue at all. The epoxy's stronger than the wood is. So that was a quick and easy repair. And I did heat the, since I was impatient, I heated the epoxy as I was mixing it over an incandescent light bulb, a 100-watt light bulb, and got it quite warm. And since it was such a small job, just 5 drops of epoxy, I think, and 5 drops of resin and 1 drop of hardener. And so that went quite quickly. And then the second end turned out just great. And then we drilled a series of very small holes instead of a series of large holes, and that worked fine. I really kind of was suspicious that the large hole might split out, and indeed it did. The other thing I wasn't totally pleased with was my rudder shaping, and I had found that about halfway down was fairly good, although I did expose the stainless steel shaft a little bit. I didn't like that, but I curved it off at the bottom, so it curved off just a little bit, maybe 1/8 of an inch even, at the bottom, and I decided that I wasn't entirely pleased with that. It didn't fit the keel quite as well as I wanted, and so I just did a fill with epoxy along the front side. First coated the wood with clear epoxy. I mixed up, how many did I mix? 1.5 large marks of resin, and I just used the standard clear resin, not the pre-thickened, because the pre-thickened is harder to sand because of the silica in it. And so I mixed up 1.5 marks, large marks of clear resin with 1.5 small marks of hardener, and coated the front edge of the keel where I was going to be filling with the clear mixture, and then I put in quite a large amount of phenolic powder, the purple powder, because I wanted an essentially non-sag mixture that was going to be easy to sand. And so it was not quite putty-like, but it was pretty much non-sag. And so then I filled, and I did quite a, I don't like to have to refill. So when I fill things, I use a lot more epoxy than really is necessary. So I filled out at least 1/8 of an inch farther forwards, so I'd have plenty of room to sand without finding I hadn't given myself enough extra material to sand it the way I wanted. So now I have a rudder that I think is the perfect shape, and it's stronger than if it was wood here. It's a harder surface. The epoxy is a harder surface. So and it was, again, I put a lamp on it, heated up the epoxy pretty warm before I started using it, and then put a lamp on it while I was setting up, and it set up in about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes. And so that's just to show that, you know, if something isn't exactly the way you want it, you can make it exactly the way you want it quite easily with the epoxy. Okay, now we're getting on to getting our keel glued in place, and that's exciting. It'll really look like a boat. We'll have some of the interior furniture to work on still, but we are making terrific progress here. Now, just a comment on my build, and the parts are all standardized and identical, but every build turns out a little bit differently because some joints are tighter and other builder might not have them quite as tight. On my build, it turns out I had to, I think you can see this, I had to file this hole in frame 6 down lower just a bit for my shaft to fit in there easily. Otherwise it was kind of hitting the bottom of that hole and jamming a little bit. So I just took a round file and cleaned that, filed that down towards the bottom of the boat, just a very small amount. And now I think everything fits exactly right. I've done my dry run, which is a good practice. Had my keel in place, and had my rudder in place. In the rudder tube, like so. My rudder swings easily. And then I marked the position of the keel, the very front edge with blue tape, and the very back edge with blue tape. So I will know exactly where to glue my keel in for the rudder to be exactly right. Because I won't be gluing in my rudder tube quite yet, and the rudder won't be in the boat while I'm gluing in the keel. And then I have a square here. What I'll be doing is clear coating first the mating surfaces, and then mixing up a batch of pre-thickened resin with enough phenolic powder in it that it has a non-sag quality, and spreading that on the bottom of the keel, and then I'll put the keel into place like it is now. And then I will take my square and sight. I'll get down level with the boat and sight to make sure that keel is exactly square. And I'll probably use a little bit of tape across from one side of the boat, over the keel, and down the other side to make sure I'm holding the keel firmly square. This keel, it seems to want to cant just a little bit this way, so the tape will be pulling it straight, but it doesn't need a whole lot of force. I would not count on the tape to be exerting a lot of force on the keel to get it straight, because the tape might let go. And in fact, anytime you use tape to hold things, this clamping mechanism, you're well advised to check it after 5 minutes, after 10 minutes, and after half an hour to make sure your tape hasn't let go. After half an hour, it's probably starting to set up enough that you won't have a problem. But if it's colder, you might check it again in 45 minutes. Because if the tape lets go and you come back the next day and the thing is canted off at a weird angle, that would be a fairly complex fix, despite the adaptability of epoxy to all situations. I'd have to think that one through. That would not be easy. You might just have to leave your keel canted. Okay, so never trust tape. It lets go as soon as your back is turned is the general rule. But it is very useful for holding things, and usually it doesn't let go. If you have it on there securely and firmly, it won't let go. Okay, so I think we're set, ready to put the keel in place and get it glued up. I did put my propeller shaft back in place. I guess just because I don't want to get any epoxy inside the tube, but I don't want to get epoxy on the shaft and have it slide inside the tube. It might not loosen itself up or free itself. It might be stuck there and not turn anymore. Okay, we all set? I think so. So let's get our epoxy going and we'll do this. This is going to be pre-thickened. The pre-thickened will saturate well enough that we'll be fine with that. Although we could do clear. Maybe we'll do clear. This is a pretty important joint. So let's use clear resin, and then we'll mix pre-thickened on top of it. We'll use probably 1/2 mark of clear resin with 1/2 mark of hardener, and then we'll switch to the pre-thickened. The clear will saturate better and give this a stronger joint. It'll give us a joint that's so strong that the joint won't ever fail without tearing massive amount of wood off with it. So yeah, we'll use clear. That's technically the proper approach to a joint that is going to have a little bit more load on it. Okay, so oh, it's still sticky. So 1/2 mark of clear resin, here's my clear, 1/2 large mark of clear resin, and 1/2 small mark of hardener. Now, especially for 1/2 mark of hardener, I really don't trust that first mark at all. So I'm going to pull in 5 small marks of hardener, and then I'll just use 1/2 of one of those marks. So I know I've got an accurate measurement, and I'll aim for 1/2, but I certainly won't go short of 1/2. I'll go a little bit more than 1/2, if anything, but definitely not less than 1/2. And we'll stir that up. And now we're coating the center line of the boat, and we're coating the top edge of the keel. So I would aim for about a 1/4 of an inch on either side of the center line for your clear coat. Let's coat inside the edges of plywood inside the slot, so we don't leave any areas uncoated. Oh, just enough left. I think I can coat my rudder with the clear coat too. And then we'll switch to pre-thickened resin for the fillet. But this should be just right for the rudder. So it's nice to combine jobs when you have a little extra epoxy. So I had just enough clear epoxy to coat the rudder, clear coat the rudder. And the key in that is to do a very thin coat so you won't get runs and sags, and to use the reflected light to see how it's going, to see how thick it is, and that it's evenly applied. Okay, and then I'm just going to set this on the edge of the table with a weight on it with horizontal. If I do it vertically, even though it's such a thin coat, I might still get runs and sags. So horizontal surfaces. Okay, now we are ready to mix our pre-thickened, because we want a no sag mixture here, and then we can apply that and glue our keel piece on. That'll be exciting. We'll have a boat then. And everything going smoothly here. So this is pre-thickened resin. You know, there's a bit of a fill because of the angled bottom, and the piece we're gluing onto it is flat. So I think we can do, let's go for 1.5 large marks and see how we come out. So there's 1.5 large marks of pre-thickened resin and 1.5 small marks of hardener. And again, I'm pulling in 5 marks and squeezing out just 1.5. And then the rest goes back in the container. Now this time we'll want to add phenolic powder for a non-sag mixture. If you see any place on your boat bottom where that first coat of clear resin has just really soaked in, it's not a bad idea to use a little bit of this before we add the phenolic powder to go over those areas, any place that looks dry, like it's all soaked in. A little bit along here. This the pre-thickened won't soak in as much, which is fine at this stage because we have pretty good saturation, especially where it looks dry and soaked in. So so this will ensure that you don't have a dry joint with all the epoxy soaking into the joint and into the wood. And the same on your keel piece. Check if you have any place that looks a little dry on there, having soaked in, get that as well. Because this mixture without the phenolic will soak in a little bit. Not as much as the clear, but it'll soak in a bit and give a perfect bond. Okay, there we go. And now the phenolic for a non-sag mixture. Oh, I need to point out that I have the hull sitting on two blocks, a block up at the front that I guess you can't quite see, and a block across at the back. And so it's sitting, there's no tendency to rock or anything. It's sitting very firmly. Both of those blocks are perpendicular to the center line of the hull, and I have a square here to check my alignment on the keel. So we're ready to boogie here, ready to go. Okay, that was about 1 full spoon of phenolic powder. We don't want it pasty and hard to spread, but we don't want to sag out of our joint either. Okay, so let's look at that and see what we've got. See, that is sagging. So let's add a teensy bit more. So that's about 1/4 of a spoon. Now that's looking pretty good. Eventually it might sag off the spoon, but that's quite a big glob, a much thicker amount than we're going to have along our keel. So when it's touching things, it tends not to sag as much as when it's just hanging on the spoon there. But we're going to put this on the keel, but actually I think this is easier. Either surface, but I'm actually finding this is quite easy to put it on here. Now remember, it's got to have enough on there to squeeze out to the sides and fill the gap caused by the angle of the bottom pieces. And this looks like we're going to have plenty here for this job. Now around the keel, around the rudder, the propeller tube aperture, we don't want to fill that up with epoxy because then we'll get epoxy on the end of the rudder tube as we poke it through. That would be a bit messy. So we're just going along the edges of that. For now. And then we'll, on the bottom piece, we are going to coat around the rudder tube on the bottom, on the keel piece itself. That's the best way not to get any epoxy onto the propeller shaft, which we've put in place, or onto the into the tube. Now, don't get when you finish, make sure you clean any epoxy off your blue tape. You don't want to have your blue tape entrapped underneath epoxy. It's just kind of messy that way. Okay, so now we're adding epoxy quite carefully and thoroughly around the propeller tube. And up in front of the propeller tube, underneath the tube, on both sides and along both sides of it. And making sure the tube itself is pretty thoroughly coated for the thickness of the bottom, where it goes through the bottom. And that's just the right amount of epoxy. I have a teensy bit of extra, but not enough to worry about. Okay, that looks pretty thorough. Now we're ready to slide that into place, and we're trying to aim perfectly so we don't get epoxy on the propeller shaft. And in watching that, we messed up at the front and scraped some of the epoxy out of place up in here. So let's get that back where we need it. Okay, and slide that right up to our tape markings, and then we'll fill from the sides where we need to, and we'll do a very tight fillet, a popsicle stick fillet on that. Let's get it centered though before we do anything else. Okay, and you know, it would have been clever to put a pencil mark on the tape as a centering point, and a pencil mark on the keel, although we can tell somewhat from the laminations what is centered and what is not. Okay, so try to center that really precisely, and then we'll use a popsicle stick here. I'm going to do a fillet. We'll probably have to go over this again, but once we tape it and get it square, we might or might not have to go over the fillet a second time. But it's so much easier to fillet it with no tape in the way that I'm going to do a fillet first and then see how that fillet works after we tape it. Okay, and anywhere your fillet isn't filling in, you'll want to add some epoxy there. I've got a small gap on this side. I need a little bit more, and a larger run on the other side. This is just going to be the right amount of epoxy, exactly right. Any less, we would have been a little bit short. There's a very nice mixture. It's smooth and easy to fillet with, but I don't think it'll sag because it's such a small fillet we're doing. Such a small, tight fillet that we're making. Okay. Check centered. That looks centered. This looks centered. And now I think I'll go ahead. I think my fillet's probably going to hold up pretty well when we do the final positioning for that keel. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off along the edges of the fillet really precisely, so we don't have, if you do the cleanup at this stage really precisely, you really can avoid having hardly any sanding, and that's nice to avoid any sanding. It's much easier to clean off the epoxy now than to sand it off later. The trick is not to mess up your fillet, of course, because then if you run your brush into your fillet, you have to refill it to get a nice smooth fillet. So then, when you get it right, just leave it alone. Don't keep messing with it, because as the epoxy sets up, it's harder and harder to, just the initial set. It's harder and harder to get it real smooth job on it. So don't keep fussing with it, because it'll mess it up. And now let's check and see how we're doing as far as square. And I think we'll probably need to tape it, although we aren't too far off, actually. A little bit off. We need to go that way just a teensy bit, which is what I anticipated. So we're going to take our tape, and I'm going to wrap it on the side that I need to pull towards more. I'm going to wrap it underneath the gunwale and up on the inside of the boat, so it's less likely to let go on this side here. Then we'll go over the top of the keel, and I'm pushing it on there pretty well on that on the rub rail and on the inside. Okay, then we'll be going over the top. If you don't get it right the first time, just do it again. Checking up here to make sure that we're still exactly centered on the center line. I think we've nailed it. The reason for taping down this along the second side is just to keep downward pressure on the tape, so it's less likely to slide at the top. There, I don't need any pressure on this second side here. Okay. Now look at it really carefully. Are you happy with everything? You feel it doesn't have any bubbles in it or anything like that. Remember, there is under that fillet's filling in the gap between the square bottom of the keel and the angled sides. So you want to make sure there's no bubble of air in there. Check your square again. How that does look. I have no idea. Didn't do it both ways. That does look just right. Absolutely right on. Okay. And I think my tape's going to hold pretty well. It's not under a lot of force or anything. Now I'm going to, so this tape doesn't get caught in the epoxy. Under the epoxy, I'm going to take that off. Looks like I can just brush a little bit smoother where that edge of the tape was, so I don't have to sand that. Okay, and take the tape off at the back, and then we're done. Very nice, very smooth job. But not to think you're totally done. At this point, it looks perfect and everything. It's just the way I want it. And I want to make sure it stays that way. So I'll time myself, and in 5 minutes I'll check it again. And in 10 minutes I'll check it again. 15 minutes and half an hour. Just a quick glance, make sure the tape hasn't let go or something's hasn't gotten knocked. And that everything's going to set up exactly the way it is right now. Because right now it's perfect. Okay, good. That was fun. Might be useful just to have another view from the side here, in case you were wondering what it looked like from this side. There's the fillet all along on this side, and fares out right into the bottom of the hull at the front, and at the back. there's the fillet. Now you can see it's a very tight, very fine fillet there between the hull and the skeg. Okay, good. And when that's set up, then we'll be ready to glue the rudder tube in place, and we'll have that whole keel and rudder tube assembly almost completed. Very well. And another angle here from the other side with slightly better light so you can see that fillet more clearly. Oopsie. There. You can see it's a very clean fillet, but a very tight small fillet, fairing right into the boat at the center line there, and nice and clean at the back end as well. Okay, and all the epoxy along the edge of the fillet has been cleaned off. It'd take just a very quick sanding to get that totally smooth along the outside edges of the fillet.